Everybody, welcome to Deep Dive. I am Shane.
I'm Amy, and today we're going to be talking about Psalm 23.
We're also going to be talking about this concept of theodicy, of like, why are bad things happening to good people, and how do we, as a society, talk about difficult things like that, and how do we talk about human worth and dignity? Really deep stuff. We have an engaging discussion. Stick around for Deep Dive.
So our scripture for this past Sunday was Psalm 23, definitely one of those that is probably very familiar to a lot of people, but listen to these words again. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. So, like I said before I read the scripture, this is definitely one of those kind of portions of scripture that is used a whole lot in the church, particularly around funerals a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's just an interesting pairing just in time that these scriptures came up during this season that we find ourselves in the world now, and truly just came up from the lectionary. I mean, this was, long ago, the planned reading for this Sunday, and it just felt particularly meaningful to me.
Yeah, I agree. We did it in worship where Amy, you read it. You read it as part of an intro where we, little sort of inside baseball for us. We tried to go find a place where we could go like hike back on a trail or something. And despite it being sort of everything close to lockdown here, we figured that was a safe way to get some social distancing to be able to do that. But it was a madhouse, the place where we went to go hike. And so we ended up just doing that back at church. But I was really thinking a lot about if we're going to be sheep, we're going to be following a path. We need to, this can't be just shot inside somewhere. And so for our worship service, we shot it out on this path we have back behind our church. But I felt like reading it with that in that context created sort of, at least for me, a very different dynamic. Just because you're focusing visually in such a different way. I thought that was very affecting. It's one of those, and I certainly deal with it in the sermon. It's one of those you just hear so much that like it doesn't. I'll be honest. It's like it's one of those that it's a psalm I really do cherish and beloved, but it's not necessarily one I always think like, oh man, I want to hear this one. And I think it's just because I've heard it so many times, and that really formed the basis of where I was going at and preaching it, because there's just parts of it. I think scripture takes a life of its own when we sort of incorporate it into our lives, but we start maybe sometimes add things to it that might not be explicitly there. And I really got at that in the sermon, because I did have that realization that I thought, well, the valley was just something we were traveling through, and the point of the shepherd was to get us through the valley, meaning like the goal was the exit, as opposed to the goal just being the presence. And I found that particularly challenging, because I feel like the current situation we're in, the exit from this is not exactly clear. And the exit for some people is contentious. What does that mean? When is that? I've said to a lot of people, it's not like we're going to know when this is quote unquote over. And so I think within that context, if we have that understanding of what we're going through, I felt, at least to me personally, it was very powerful to be reminded that the point is not, necessarily, the point is the journey, and that Jesus is with us on this journey as opposed to the destination. As preachers, we're always sort of, the only story I can really preach effectively is my own. And I'm not so arrogant to feel like I can tell other people's stories the same way. And so there sometimes comes in an inherent limitation in that there's just parts of the gospel I've never experienced in the same way as someone else. And so I I'm sure 23 hits people, a lot of people, very different ways, particularly if you're someone who recently lost a loved one or someone you just really cared for. Psalm 23 is going to sound really different. Um, but I think that's kind of the beauty of the text too. It just works in a lot of ways. I mean, it's not like it was written intentionally to be a funeral song.
Sure.
So I think it's helpful to understand that. But I was just struck by that a lot this week. The point is the presence and the point, and I really wanted to key in on that phrase of mercy and goodness following. But I like the translation of pursue much better. Your thoughts on that? What's your relationship with that text?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, these are obviously very familiar words, but I thought that you lifted up some really interesting things, particularly about the valley. And so I'm thinking about for us collectively right now that a lot of formation happens in the valley.
Mm-hmm.
And those are maybe low places that we don't want to go. We don't voluntarily oftentimes go there, but the kind of formation and the work that God can do in and through us during those valley times, and just being open to being formed, which, and I keep bringing this back to Lent, but that is what we strive for a lot of times during the season of Lent. Now, I've seen the memes going around, people saying, listen, I didn't know I was going to give up this much for Lent this year, but I do, it's just an interesting season in the church to be thinking about being in the valley and the formation that can happen there, and in the good work that we're called to do, each of us. And I know for us as a community, as a church, we've seen people really reach out to one another and to stretch, themselves, and particularly these sorts of things that you and I have been doing with online. We have a group that meets, 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. and it's open to anyone. And these are folks who've never used, like this kind of online technology for meetings. It was really pretty new to me too. Mm-hmm. And so I've said, this is all a learning curve, but being in the valley that we find ourselves in, and being open to trying new things and to reaching people in new ways, I think is really powerful.
Yeah, exactly. I think kind of the challenge for us is the orientation to the valley. And I think the trick in understanding this is our orientation that we see this period of time in some ways, not exclusively, but in some ways as an opportunity for personal development, as opposed to spending the time worrying about what we've lost. I'm very interested to see, as we go through this as a culture, as a society, if we'll have the wisdom to be able to emerge from this, sort of shedding the things, or at least having our relationship to some things change. Like this isn't as important as I thought it was. That isn't to minimize the cost of this valley. The costs are very real. And that's why we're in this valley, is to mitigate the cost is more. That's why we've kind of doubled down on this valley to mitigate the cost. And but that being said, as we are distancing, if we find ourselves in good health, if we find ourselves with, the worst thing in our life is a lot of free time, I don't really consider that a bad thing in this season of life. I said to a colleague this morning, one of the things that's interesting is I do see this as a particular time in our lives to explore things creatively. Because we were not giving ourselves time to do this beforehand. And now some people might find themselves doing that now. And it might be just as simple as creative ways of doing family. How do we have fun together? How do we enjoy one another in this more compact environment? But I mean that to expand to the arts, to all the different ways we can be creative. And I really do see those things opportunity, because to me, I relate it to sort of what we know about children, is that, if you want a child to be creative, you need to have that child be bored. And I think we, unfortunately, for the last, particularly the last 20 years, we've acted as though boredom is our enemy. And to really the extent of the situation we're in, boredom really is an asset to us, because it gives us the opportunity to read more, play more music, connect more, talk more with people. And that can be a blessing, provided we are find ourselves in good health in this situation. Obviously, it completely changes if someone finds themselves in ill health or struggling. And, so I don't want to minimize that for people. But I think for the vast majority, even because of the nature of this illness, the vast majority of people are going to just find themselves, with a lot of time on their hands. Now, I ask again, and I really want to be clear, I don't want to minimize this because this has enormous economic impacts for people like that. It's one thing to have a full belly and not worry about money, and you're sitting around being bored, versus you're being bored because you lost this job, and it creates this vacuum of just literally how are you paying for food and housing and things like that. So I don't want to minimize that. I think even in that, there is some opportunity for more full reliance on God. And I don't say that as a God is the magic answer to every problem. And so I think I've had I've been very frustrated, and this isn't surprising. There have definitely been a lot of preachers that are using this as an opportunity to just say ridiculous things like, well, my faith's strong in Jesus, so I won't get it, or I'm going to be okay. And so what I mean, our development with God, fully relying on God, I don't mean to be going down that path at all. I just mean, I mean that God is the one we go to with these anxieties. God is the one we go to with this sort of spiritual longing. God is the one we go to with this mourning. I mean, I think that's an important thing to remind people in this time that, if you are a sheep in the dark valley, if you are in the presence of your enemies, that is angst-ridden, and you are probably going to be bleating. You are probably going to be complaining to the shepherd. And this is a time I think people do need to be reminded it is 100% appropriate to pray angry prayers to God at your level of frustration and what's going on. Because if there's any being, I know I've said this before, if there is any being in existence that can handle that, it is God. You do not need to protect God from your anger. Because if you're not willing to sort of open that up in your conversation with God, I don't think you are opening yourselves up for a deeper realization or a deeper relationship there where you can understand that God can absorb that and not run away from you.
Yeah, so a few things there. Just on that very last point, I mean, there are plenty of places in Scripture where that is held up for us, of people, being discontent, being angry, and bringing those things to God. And I think sometimes we don't see that as part of our own worship. So to be able to reclaim some of that, I think it would be very powerful.
Yeah, and this was pointed out to me by one of our members in a conversation this week is, what's Psalm 22, the one right before Psalm 23, which is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" that Jesus ends up using in his words on the cross. And so that there is that proximity, that a good, I don't know, at least a third of the Psalms are Psalms of mourning. Now the Psalms of mourning are so interesting. And I think that's probably a really good place to be reading right now. The Psalms just in general, but in particular the Psalms of mourning, because they're not exclusively mourning. It represents sort of this dynamic ebb and flow of a relationship where it may begin with mourning but ends in praising. It may begin with praising and ends in mourning. It has that sort of narrative arc to it. I think is really important to remember, because if we are built in the image of God, we are built for relationship, and God understands those relationships. And I think to me, this is the sort of construct I feel that I have understood about God is, I sometimes in the height of anger don't have the ability to control myself in the way I wish I could. I don't have the ability in the midst of anxiety all the time to be able to say, now, if I love myself in this person, how would I behave? And I think that's what makes me not God. It's not just the powers to create and all this. It's the ability to regulate one to always orient toward love. And that's an interesting thing if we understand God in that regard, that God has the ability to absorb and interact with these things and understands them, because these are things that God self, I think, experiences. But God in that same regard has this divine ability to regulate God's self in order to always orient toward love. And I think that's a very helpful thing to remind this situation, because we're particularly, and this is something we might touch on now, is the idea of, theodicy, of why are bad things happening? Or, why are, theodicy is the fancy word for it. I wish I could give a better definition, but, why are bad things happening? Are these signs of God's judgment and things like that? And it's so easy for people to go there, partially just because people are willing to say it. I don't think it's right. Absolutely. No way do I think it's right. I do not think it's right that, I do not think it was God's will that particular people got hit by this tornado that just wrecked us a while ago. In the same regard, I don't think it is God's particular will that any certain individuals are getting this or becoming gravely ill or dying from this. But this is a time because frankly, because we have the time to think about it, we have to grapple with questions like this. So I'm curious about your thoughts on theodicy.
Yeah. Well, that would be a very big topic to dive into because, theodicy a lot of the times has also this tone of why are these bad things happening to good people?
Yes.
Having that tacked on there. And that makes that conversation for me even more difficult because who is defining good and bad people? And that complicates that kind of conversation even more.
Yeah, I think that conversation culturally is going to play out for us now in the way we're dealing with this because good,
right.
Exchange a word, good, valuable, and I think the tone.
That's a perfect word for right now.
Yeah, and that's something I'd love to discuss here. Is that I think where we're heading as a society is a very complicated debate because we have politicians and certain individuals that are so invested in the economics of this that in their mind, it is superseding any sort of public health benefit. And so it can be framed, and I think it could be rightfully framed as this. It just doesn't mean this is the path you choose, as though it could be rightfully framed that we are having people of prime working age, younger people in school, all delaying their life and putting off their wealth or access to wealth in order to save the lives of our oldest Americans, many of which who benefited from much more stable economic conditions, who are much more stable economic positions, and have, frankly, less life to live unless we have our first person that's going to live to 150 in this age. We don't know. And so one could frame it like that. One could frame it like that and just say, why are bad things happening to these valuable worker or this valuable business or small business? And boy, I understand how people get there because you'll see the loss of businesses and things like that. It's just, man, that's tough because we read all of that through our just capitalistic lens as consumeristic Americans. And this idea of common good is really hard for us to get behind because we have such an individualistic mentality of everything. I heard someone was referencing, I think, a David Brooks column. They were talking about comparing a pandemic, what we're going through, to a natural disaster. And we should get this more than anything here in Nashville because a natural disaster comes through, whether it's the flood 10 years ago or the tornado, a month ago, whenever it was. Oh my gosh, it seems like a year ago, right?
Yes.
The tornado comes through and everybody rallies and we see each other. And we're out on the streets and we're helping each other. And there's this community spirit to the point here in Nashville. So many people have volunteered. We had to tell people to stop volunteering because they were getting in everyone's way in order to fix things. There's that. But then on the other hand, you have a pandemic where you don't see each other. And you don't emerge from this with this camaraderie that you would emerge. I wasn't here 10 years ago, but everyone I've heard talks about this, the flood as being a crucible that the community, maybe you could speak to that, Amy, about that flood as a crucible that made us come together.
Oh, absolutely. It was absolutely insane when that happened in Nashville. And, just to see all of, downtown, to see different parts of the community just completely destroyed, but then immediately, as soon as people were able to get out of their houses, it was just an outpouring of love, support, resources. And I really do think that was a foundational moment for the future of us as a city. So I absolutely see that. And just the dichotomy now of, that's what we want to be doing. And that's what people did immediately for folks that were, affected by the tornado recently. And now the loving thing to do, in my opinion, is to stay away. Right. And so how do now we support those people affected by the tornado, but not just them, all the people who don't have what they need right now. Room in the Inn, which is our winter shelter program, was going to be coming, to an end for the season just because of where we are in the year now. But across the city, they stopped having Room in the Inn because it wasn't safe for churches to take in folks who are without homes at this point. And so what are we called to in those kinds of situations? And I have to go back to what you were talking about a second ago. And I have been so angry, particularly over the last 24 hours, about this conversation that seems to be emerging about people's, what makes someone valuable, and what are they contributing? And I mean, I have been filled with anger hearing this because I can't even hardly articulate it, because people have value because they are human. It is not about
that's what I was going to say. It seems like a dehumanizing analysis, just to say, because the analysis of someone is, what can you give me?
Right.
Or it's the other inherent problem we have as a nation of just overvaluing youth. In the sense that, like, ever since the 40s, 50s, sort of on, pop culture has been youth culture, even when it doesn't involve a younger person, even if it's a show that's primarily middle-aged individuals, it still is sort of cast in the mold of youth culture. Ever since, advertisers were able to identify, teenagers and above, and even kids, as something they can make money off of. This is something we've gone as a society. So it's so dehumanizing to just say, like, what do you contribute to culture? What do you contribute financially? What do you, all these sort of things. And I can't help but think, listening, if I was someone in one of these risk groups, if I was an older individual, I could not help but think and listen and just say, like, I'm just not valued. I mean, I can't, that's got to be heartbreaking to feel. And, I know we don't really talk politics. I don't think this is a politic thing, but I know the lieutenant governor of Texas goes on the air yesterday, and he talks about grandparent, Dan Patrick is his name. And he goes on and he says, grandparents would gladly die for their kids to essentially have a job again. I was like, man, you cannot speak for people like that. That is unreal.
He received an email from me yesterday.
Oh, did he? Okay.
He sure did.
Yeah. Yeah.
I cannot, this is one thing I cannot handle. And I just can't handle it. I can't handle it. That dehumanizing, that devaluing that you're talking about is so hurtful. It just has to be stopped. And I think that it's a time that people who see the value in other people, they need to reach out and say, I disagree with this.
Yeah.
Here is why, because it can still be a conversation.
Yeah. I think there is, I think within churches just in general, really, no matter the church, unless it's like one of these churches that's nothing but 20 somethings, but churches in general skew older than the average population, just because that's kind of the way religion, at least in the United States, works. As you get older, typically, you become a little more religious. There's also some generational differences. We're yet to really tell if those generational differences are just because of where they are. And, that this generation's young, well, therefore young equals less religious. We don't know how to weight those things yet. That being said, churches just tend to be older populations than your average society. And so I do think there could be a little skewing in the other direction, that's only seeing it from a primarily older position. But if you want to compare the dangers of those exclusive positions, one that's overvaluing youth and one that's overvaluing old, I think the danger of overvaluing youth and productivity and worth is so much more dehumanizing, because the other one is not dehumanizing. It's not. I don't think it's dehumanizing to have that perspective from a more older congregation, because it's more life centric as opposed to like capital centric or wealth centric or things like that. And and so that's where I am. I've had those discussions internally. I've had those with members just because I saw this debate unfolding like a week ago. I just kept thinking of like, this is where we're headed.
Mhm.
And I just think like, I think there is potential for a lot of conflict here, even sometimes within churches. I think there's a lot of cultural conflict at play, and some of that could be a communications issue. Some of that could just be partisanism. It's hard to determine, but it is a complicated thing right now because I guess I would just encourage all of us to just value, if we're going to value life, we need to value life in this regard, in this particularly right now, and try to avoid things that just essentially make boil people down to ledger sheets and things that we can quantify in that regard. So obviously, this is a really challenging time for the church right now. And to me, one of the really challenging elements is church to me is really about joy. As Presbyterians, we say, the chief end of humanity is to glorify and enjoy God forever. And I really do believe in the enjoy part. I think the way we enjoy God is enjoying community, enjoying worship, enjoying all this, just literally what it means to be human, to enjoy that life. But that's really hard right now, the communal aspects of that. And so churches are doing really, I think, some interesting things to try to do that. And we're struggling to find that ourselves. We're doing the online thing. We're connecting with people. It's funny to hear people of all these different ages get on web chats and just giggle like school kids, to see each other, which is really sweet. But Amy, you showed me an article the other day about a church down in Texas that was doing a drive-in church. Can you tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I have the opportunity to be part of this Facebook group, having lots of these conversations about where do we go from here and helping resource churches and all of those things. So there was an idea, and they actually tried it out, of having like kind of the old timey drive-in movie theater, but actually doing a drive-in worship experience with very strict stipulations. No one gets out of the car. You're not rolling anything down, but they're using FM radio to be able to broadcast in each other's cars. And it was just like, what a creative idea. And so that's actually, I've seen now an idea that's picking up a little bit. So now more churches are giving that a try.
Yeah, that's interesting. I love seeing these creative things. It's always some degree of a gamble with something like that, because we're still reliant on each other to use best practices when we do things like that.
Yes.
But I do, this is where I get back to what I was saying earlier about, like, I do think these are opportunities to reimagine and recreate, because it can be very meaningful. I often think in terms of like, what are we going to say about this 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20, 30, whatever, we're going to look back at this and say, like, what did we learn about God with? What did we learn about our capacity to care for each other and be creative within that? Because we have to be open to the idea that, like, ways that we can be creative in that way become like impactful in lifelong ways, because we're in such interesting situations right now. And so I love seeing churches do things like that. And we're trying to do what we can within that. That's church, plagiarism doesn't exist in the same way in the church. You see a good idea, you think that's a good idea, you do it, because as churches, that church that did the drive-in church isn't going to say, well, that's our copyright, no one's going to do it. For us, the 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. thing, I saw a church doing that, and I thought, this is an amazing idea. How do we connect with one another? And so I think that's why I love seeing that. It's just because, like, the best idea wins. You just sort of choose the idea and you try for it, because, how do we get each other to laugh and enjoy one another right now? One of the things I think we're going to start doing here soon is actually just have like game nights where I'm gonna try to, I'll get a suit on or something, and I'm gonna try to host a game night from our home where people can watch on YouTube and participate online or through Zoom or something like that. So how do we see each other? We've done cousin movie nights where we prop up an iPad, we hit play on the movie at the same time, and then we all watch a movie together, which was surprisingly easy. It's not the same thing as being in person, because everyone like wrestling with each other and all that stuff doesn't just happen naturally. But it was nice to sort of be there together and just be able to giggle at that, because I think right now what I'm seeing, particularly in the people we're interacting with, is there's a lot of grace in realizing that no one's perfect at doing this.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So thinking about the movie idea, and I've not tried this out, but Netflix has the Netflix party where
Mm-hmm.
it's set up for you to be able to watch movies together. So that would be an option to give a go. My daughter Addie's going to be playing Mario Kart a little bit later with my cousin who lives in Chattanooga. So, I mean, just these kind of ways that we can connect and have fun together,
Yeah.
I think is important.
I feel like I'd be interested to talk to someone from like gaming, like who is a big time gamer. I feel like people within the gaming community have probably adapted to this with zero problems, because so much of their life is spent online, like playing games together, or even spent online with things like Twitch, which is a service that essentially just live streams other people playing games and them talking about it, which is just this enormous market. So enormous that a few years ago, Amazon bought Twitch because they saw the growth potential in it. It's where you're literally just watching someone else play a video game and talk about it. I think it almost establishes, it reminds me a little bit of like the highest watched show on Netflix are things like The Office and Friends. And they're the type of shows that are often watched by people that are not of the generations that watch this. So, but they watch it because it establishes this sort of like baseline where they're like not really watching it, but kind of, not really watching, but it kind of provides the background noise. And I always think of that like within the gaming community. I think that's probably a strong element of that connectivity. So if you've heard us before, if you haven't, we have this part where we like to do recommendations for you. But during this time where you probably have some extra time on your hands, or you're looking for something to lift you up, we're going to expand this a little bit. So not only we're going to have some recommendations for you, we're just want to share some links with you and talk about some stuff that made us laugh or made us smile. And just pass that on to you because you need a little dose of happy every day. So Amy, you got something for us?
Yeah, so it's funny that you said lifted because that's actually part of my Makes Me Smile recommendation. So there's a video on YouTube of Kenny Rogers singing with the Muppets, actually. Wow. And they're singing the song Love Lifted Me. And I have watched this so many times recently. It's only about 3 minutes long, but you will be singing it the rest of the day.
Yeah, that's great.
Checking out.
We'll put links for all these things down in the show notes, both on YouTube and on the podcast stream. So hopefully you'll be able to check those things out and smile along with us. My thing that made me laugh that I recommend is it's so dumb. It's just a video of cats ringing a bell in order to get food. And my wife and I sat around and watched it the other day and we're like, whatever, watch it. And there's also one of these same cats that are just watching dominoes go down, like fall down. And it's so, the look on these cats' face as they're ringing a bell to get food just makes me cry laughing. And Ashley was just laughing out loud. It was so funny. So that gave me some joy. Yeah. Any other things that made you laugh or made you smile?
So this is also a cat thing. I don't know if you've seen the video where they've dressed these cats up and they're basically doing a fashion show. So they have the camera down on the ground and the cats are just walking towards you. And it looks like they're wearing all these fancy little outfits. It's amazing.
That's hilarious. Another thing we'll put in the notes and recommend is I don't know if you're familiar with the comedian John Mulaney. Yes. He's a fairly clean comedian that he has some stand-up shows on on Netflix. I think he's got a couple specials on there. He was but he was a staff writer on Saturday Night Live for a while. And when he sort of became famous with stand-up, they had him come back and host. And so I think he's hosted 3 or 4 times now. And so a few times ago, they put a sketch on that was never able to make the air because it was just so ridiculous that when he was a writer there. And it's about a diner in New York where a guy orders a lobster. And you might have seen this because it sort of made it all the way over the internet. And it's ludicrous. And then the next time he hosted, he followed it up with one about a guy in a bodega asking you to use a bodega bathroom, yes, which is just absurd. Well, this is a trilogy and it has now been completed. And his most recent hosting from a couple weeks ago, he does one about a couple guys ordering food at a LaGuardia little sandwich shop, and a guy orders sushi at the LaGuardia. And it is so ridiculous. And if you're someone who likes musicals and just like comedy that is absurd. It's so funny because everyone is an homage to some of the biggest, broadest, most famous musicals out there. And they are just laugh out loud hilarious. But my wife and I were just like losing it laughing the other day when we finally got around to watching the third one. So that's one that the problem is if you watch something like that on YouTube, it's going to link you to about like 50 other things that you're going to lose, half your day, which might be fine. You might need that sort of escapism, but I would commend that to you. The John Mulaney trilogy of just ridiculousness.
Yeah. So we've talked about the 8s that we're doing, the 8 a.m., 8 p.m. So I have started, when I'm hosting that, have started using a book that I've had absolutely forever. It's Celtic Daily Prayers. I'll send that to you so that you can post that down below too. But it's just really amazing. It has very short, like kind of small paragraphs that go with scripture reading for every day of the year. And it does the morning, afternoon, evening prayer and leads folks through that too. So I think it's a great resource for this time.
Yeah, we watched a movie the other night. I believe it's on HBO now, but you can get it anywhere. It's just called Yesterday. It's a movie that imagines a guy in England is riding a bike. He's a struggling artist, sort of showed some promise as a kid, but then never realized a struggling artist was riding his bike home from a gig, got hit by a bus during a worldwide power outage, and wakes up in a world where no one's ever heard of the Beatles.
Oh.
And so he alone remembers the Beatles songs and just sort of writes them out and sort of passes them off as his own because he's like, no one's heard of these. All of a sudden I have this entire catalog of the greatest songs I've ever heard that no one's ever heard of. And so he launches his musical career. It is funny and affecting at the same time. But the other reason to enjoy it, it's literally it's a movie just full of Beatles songs where, it's not the Beatles singing, it's different sort of covers of it, but it's great. I'm not like a sing along to movies type of guy, but I was singing along to this because it's pretty delightful in that way. And it's a pretty harmless watch. There's not a lot of ups and downs in it other than just being a good, enjoyable, sweet movie. So it's called Yesterday. I believe it's on HBO right now, but I'm sure it's other places that one can rent because it's been out for a while. Well, that is it for Deep Dive. Thank you for joining us. Like us, subscribe to us, share us with your friends. Every week we will have lots of these interesting conversations about what we're dealing with in worship and issues going on in culture. There is so much to talk about now. We're doing our best to try to have honest, transparent conversations with you about difficult issues, realizing that we've not ever completely nailed it or got it right every week. And so we really thank you for joining us. Amy, got anything to say before we head out?
No, I hope that you'll watch again next week.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just great to interact with you. Stay safe, stay at home, enjoy your family, hug your kids, wave at your neighbors. I don't know, start a barbershop quartet where you're all each in your driveways and singing together, all those creative ways that we can do community together. Well, that's it for Deep Dive. Take care. We will see you next week. See ya.
Bye-bye.